Hello, my friends, and today I'd like to start with some good news. Everyone knows that for several days now, the Kremlin's special envoy has been in the United States trying to convince them that Russia is achieving great successes on the front lines and that its economy won't suffer from the new sanctions and so on. But the US no longer believes Russia, and that's the most important thing. Bessant commented on Dmitriev's statements, saying that he's a propagandist and shouldn't be taken seriously at all.
I want to ask you the U.S. sanctioned Russia's top oil and gas companies this past week. But Vladimir Putin's envoy, who is here in the United States, Kirill Dmitriev, I know you know him, said the sanctions will have, quote, absolutely no effect on Russia's economy. They will simply lead to higher prices at gas stations in the United States. Is Dmitriev wrong? And when will Russia actually feel the pain?
Well, I think Russia is going to feel the pain immediately. I can tell you that we've already seen India has done a complete halt of Russian oil purchases. Many of the Chinese refineries they have stopped. And, Margaret, are you really going to publish what a Russian propagandist says? I mean, what else is he going to say? That, oh, it's going to be terrible and it's going to bring Putin to the table? Of course. The Russian economy is a wartime economy. Growth is virtually zero. Inflation, I believe, is over 20%. And everything we do is going to bring Putin to the table. It's oil that funds the Russian war machine, and I think we can make a substantial dent in his profits.
As we can see, he made it clear that the Trump administration doesn't take Dmitriev seriously anymore. They no longer believe Russia the way they once did. We'll see how much further the pressure on Russia increases, since for now it's still not enough. And attacks along the front line continue to intensify. Meanwhile, Peskov is shouting that if the US supplies Ukraine with Tomahawks, there will be a terrible response.
Could Russia's response be shocking? What exactly do these words mean?
A shocking response. I think that's perfectly clear. There's been a lot of speculation lately. Even Zelensky himself recently said that they have the military capability to strike deep into Russia. Naturally, our armed forces and Russia will respond harshly to that. And as Putin said, the response will be shocking.
There's a strong suspicion that the missiles Ukraine is boasting about are simply repainted British missiles.
Well, obviously, they could be British, they could be German, they could be Italian, whatever. But it's clear that Ukraine itself is hardly capable of producing such missiles right now. At the very least, the key components and parts of these missiles are pure imports from Europe.
But Ukraine is also trying to stop Russia. Strikes on Russian oil refineries continue. Today it's reported that a fire broke out at an oil refinery in Serpukhov, Moscow region, and late last night there were new reports of drones flying toward Moscow, which means the strikes are continuing. Now, let's move on to the situation along the front line, starting with the Dobropillia direction. And there is finally some good news here. Ukrainian forces are seeing progress. For now, this is the only sector where the Russians are being steadily pushed back. It's clear that the armed forces of Ukraine have managed to advance from several sides and tighten the encirclement around Russian positions. However, since Ukraine is conducting limited counterattacks rather than a full-scale counteroffensive, and because the Russians continue to launch massive mid-wave assaults, they're still trying to achieve local gains and are already pushing towards Shahove. Yesterday, Ukrainian fighters confirmed through their videos that they destroyed Russian troops who had managed to break through into Shahove. So the situation here remains tense, but there is still hope that Ukraine will eventually be able to crush the Russians and stabilize the front line in this area. Meanwhile, in the Pokrovsk direction, the situation continues to deteriorate. The Russians are assaulting Rodinsk and Krasny Liman, breaking through from two sides toward the outskirts of Mirnograd. Fierce fighting is ongoing in Novoekonomichne, and the Russians are storming Promень, Sukhий Yar, Lysivka, Novopavlivka, Gnativka, Pokrovsk, and Molodetske, while also advancing near Udachne and Kotlane. Unfortunately, it has now been confirmed that Russian forces have advanced beyond Zvirove toward the village of Grishine, gaining around 4.5 kilometers. If they manage to break through fully to Grishine, the situation will worsen even further, as the Russians have already entrenched themselves in the industrial zone, from where they can control Ukrainian logistics with FPV drones very effectively. Reports suggest that a cauldron has already formed in this area. From the last confirmed frontline positions, only 8.5 kilometers remain. Although in reality, the gray zone is much wider, meaning the situation is even more complicated than it looks. The depth of this pocket is about 12 kilometers. That means Ukrainian defenders in the Lysivka and Sukhий Yar areas must either hold their positions in near encirclement or cover at least 12 kilometers to reach secure supply lines. Ammunition deliveries can now only be made by drones, so overall the situation here is critical. Ukrainian troops are essentially holding the defense while surrounded. And Zelensky commented on the situation.
The Russians have concentrated their main strike group against Pokrovsk. That's a significant number of enemy troops. Of course, this creates a difficult situation in Pokrovsk and in all the neighboring areas. Fierce fighting is happening everywhere, including on the approaches to the city. There are enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups inside the city, and logistics is difficult. But we must keep destroying the occupiers and keep inflicting the maximum possible losses on them. Russian plans, their offensive campaign over these 10 months, have once again been torn apart thanks to the bravery of our warriors.
Friends, please share your opinions about this in the comments. And now let's move to the situation around Novopavlivka. Things are a bit better here. The Russians have slowed their advance and the front line has been stabilized. Still, attacks continue across the fields to Dobropillia. They are also assaulting Dachne and pushing in the area of Piddubne. Over the last 24 hours, there have been no changes to the line. And in the direction of the village of Pokrovsk in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the situation is catastrophic. The entire front has once again collapsed, and the Russians have captured several settlements at once. The front line now essentially runs along the river, but they're already trying to push beyond it. They are assaulting Sosnivka, Oleksiivka, Verbove, Vishneve, and Pavlivka, and pushing toward the area of Novovasilievska. There is also a large number of artillery strikes being reported, and the situation is extremely difficult. In the Gulay-Pole direction, the Russians are breaking through near Malinivka and shelling Gulay-Pole, but there have been no changes along the front line so far. In the Zaporizhia direction, the Russians are pushing toward Novoandriivka, and assaulting Stepove and Stepnohirsk. The situation remains difficult, but so far the Ukrainian forces have been able to repel all attacks, and there have been no changes along the front line. In the Kherson direction, the Russians are advancing near the Antonivsky Bridge and continue along the right bank. However, there have been no changes along the front line here either. In fact, the Russians have even stopped claiming that they're capturing new islands in the area. So for now, the situation remains stable. Now let's move to the Konstantinivka direction. Here, the Russians are assaulting Protechine, pushing beyond Alexandru Shultine, and fighting for Plashiivka. After the latest shifts along the front line, the Russians are now advancing toward Ilyinka. Attacks also continue in the area of Rosen Yar, and for several days in a row, we've seen small but consistent changes along the line. The Russians are gradually getting closer to Konstantinivka, so the situation here is getting worse. In the Siversk direction, the Russians are assaulting Yampil, pushing toward the outskirts of Siversk and advancing near Serebryanka. This means that the battles for Siversk have already begun, and it's clear that if the Russians succeed here, they will move directly toward Slovyansk. So at this point, a decisive battle is underway. In the Liman direction, the Russians are assaulting Zarychne, Drobyshevo, and Novoselivka, pushing beyond Serednye, and reports indicate attacks near Korovy Yar. However, there have been no changes along the front line here so far. The fighting continues. In the Borova direction, the Russians are attacking Bohuslavka, but they haven't achieved any success, and the front line has remained unchanged over the past 24 hours. In the Kupiansk direction, the Russians are attempting to advance in the area of Peshane, while the situation in Kupiansk itself has stabilized for now. The Ukrainian forces are preventing the Russians from moving further, and the front line remains unchanged. In the Dvorichna direction, the Russians didn't launch any new assaults, and the situation has remained the same over the past 24 hours. In the Veliki Burluk direction, the Russians are attacking Kolodezhne, Dvorichanske, and Bolohivka. However, Ukrainian forces have so far managed to repel all assaults, and there have been no changes along the front line, although Russian activity remains quite high. The Russians are trying to straighten the line of contact in this area. In the Kharkiv direction, things remain relatively quiet. The Russians haven't launched any new assaults, and the number of shelling incidents is minimal. In Vovchansk, battles continue daily, but Ukrainian forces are successfully repelling all attacks, and the situation remains stable. However, late last night, the Russians released a video allegedly showing their flag raised over the industrial area of the oil extraction plant in the southern part of Vovchansk. Though we are still waiting for official comments from the Ukrainian side regarding this claim. In the Sumy direction, Russian activity is minimal, though the Russians carried out a few attacks near the villages of Konstantinivka and Yunakivka. However, the front line remains unchanged. Today, foreign analysts have already calculated how much territory the Russians have advanced over the past 7 days. Their gains amount to 82 square kilometers, and including the gray zone, 129 square kilometers. Ukraine has managed to retake 29 square kilometers, and including the gray zone, 37 square kilometers. So the struggle continues.